And welcome to the next lecture for American Economic History Online. This is our second section. We're going to take a look at colonial development. In particular, a couple of things that we're going to really stress. Number one, we're going to take a look at regional specialization. It's one of the things we're going to take a bit of time on in this section. So we're going to take a look at regional specialization, but in particular, we want to take a look at how regional specialization impacted regional economic development in the colonies. In particular, why did certain areas of the colonies specialize in the productions of certain goods? So that's what we're going to be concerned with. For example, what did New England produce? What did the middle colonies produce? And what did the southern colonies produce? Also, that regional specialization, obviously, if you're talking about what is being produced, you're going to be looking at labor conditions. So we're going to take a look at how this regional specialization impacted the distribution of slavery. Why is it that in certain regions of the colonies that slavery was much more important? For example, in the South, slavery was a much more important labor institution than it was in New England. So I want to take a look at some of the reasons and the rationale, the economic rationales for why that exactly occurred. And finally, we're going to take a look at colonial trade, particularly who were the important trading partners with the colonies. Also, we're going to take a look at, with the individual regions, who were the most important trading partners, for example, of New England versus the South or the middle colonies, etc. But then we're also going to look at which portions of the colonies had greater trade deficits. So we're going to look at patterns of trade between the colonies and the outside world, and then we're going to take a look at the patterns of trade with the regions within the colonies: New England, middle colonies, upper South, lower South, and who were their most important trading partners. But on top of that, what regions were running larger trade deficits or larger trade surpluses than other regions of the colony. So, for example, how did the balance of trade fare between New England and Great Britain compared to the lower South and Great Britain? So make sure that you're aware of these things. Number one, these are the things that we're going to take a look at. Regional specialization, how it impacted colonial development, how it impacted distribution of slaves, and then we want to understand the direction of colonial trade, imports and exports, but we want to also take a look at trade balances with the colonies. So when we talk about regional specialization with the colonies, the one thing that you should be concerned with is natural endowments. What benefits did each region have? For example, the type of climate that the region had is very important. All right, the South has a very different climate than New England. So that climate's going to impact the type of, for example, agriculture that's going to be undertaken. Soil, the richness of the soil. The soil in the South is going to be vastly different than the soil in New England. Topography, it's going to be very important. You have a lot of mountains versus a lot of flatlands. And also, trees are going to be a very important resource for building, for heat source, but also, when we talk about New England, the availability and the quality of the trees is going to relate to the building of ships, which is very important during the time period. And also the availability of minerals is going to be important. The exploitation of these resources is going to be important, and the knowledge that you need to exploit those resources. All right, so given the resources that are available, given the technology that's available to the individuals, that's what we're going to talk about is with comparative advantage. And comparative advantage in economists means producing at a lower opportunity cost. So as an econ major, you should be familiar with this. A comparative advantage means that producing at a lower opportunity cost than other individuals. So that's what we mean by efficiency. All right, and we say that the North was more efficient at producing a particular commodity than the South was. What we are saying is that the North had a lower opportunity cost of production. It meant that it had to lose less in the production of that particular item. Now realize that when the colonists first came over, that the learning that they did and the understanding and the knowledge that they gained was mostly from a trial and error basis, the notion of learning by doing. Okay, I can give you a personal example for this. I've been increasingly using Sakai to develop online courses, adding some elements of Sakai in my in-classroom teaching. And in essence, a lot of that has been on the basis of me teaching myself to do those things. So it's been trial and error, experimenting with things. If it works, continue to use it. If it doesn't work, then try something else. So realize that that is the type of knowledge gained, the technology, the ability to grow crops was gained on a trial and error basis. So for example, if you went to Pennsylvania, which strains of wheat grew the best? There's a multitude of different strains of wheat that can be grown, but given the climate and given the soil, only certain types of wheat will grow the best. So you grow different types of wheat, and eventually you figure out what types of wheat grow the best in Pennsylvania. All right, this might be completely different than the best wheats to grow out in Kansas. So you have to try growing different crops and seeing which ones grow the best. Which local crops, so you could try to grow other things, corn, etc., tomatoes, might not necessarily have the climate or the soil to grow those things. So remember that this is what was going on, particularly in the earliest colonial period. You try growing crops, and if you succeed, you keep growing them. If it's disastrous, you move on to growing different crops. And also importantly, we're going to end up talking about where tobacco could be grown. This was a cash, quote unquote, a cash crop for a portion of the colonial time period, where there's a dramatic increase in the demand for tobacco, and as the demand went up, the price went up. So it was very profitable to grow tobacco. Well, if you go over to the United States, there's only certain regions that you can grow tobacco. If you go to New England, you're not going to be very successful in growing tobacco. If you try to grow it in New Jersey, you'll be a little bit more successful, but you won't be as successful, for example, if you grow it in Virginia, in that area there. So that's what understanding a portion of regional specialization, that the individuals had to learn what crops grew the best in the colonies. There was nobody there to tell them what was the best, so they would grow different crops and determine which ones were the best, which ones had that comparative advantage in that particular region, and that is what they ended up specializing in. Initially, if we talk about, for example, the South had very great success in growing two commodities, particularly rice and indigo. Indigo is used for a dye stuff for dyeing fabrics, etc. So there was initially great success in rice growing and in the production of indigo. And over time, this eventually changed when it was found that cotton could be grown in the South, and two, that the slave labor system was amenable to it was a very efficient way of growing cotton. And as a textile, the Industrial Revolution occurred in Great Britain, and there was a great increase in textile production, i.e. cloth, that there was a dramatic increase in demand for cotton. So I just want you to realize that about the South, that the South wasn't always a cotton growing region. Initially, rice and indigo were the main staple products that were grown in the South. The other thing I want you to realize about the early colonization is that a portion of what occurred, and even some colonies were specifically founded on thinking that they were going to find a lot of gold, silver, and other precious metals. Some people had the naive assumption that they would just go to this new world and gold and silver would be lying around that they could just pick up, and they would become instantaneously rich if they could live through the travel across the Atlantic and back again. So realize that there was also this conception that there was a fortune to be made in precious metals or different types of ores. So that's the question that comes up after this point is, what am I gonna be most profitable in doing? Just like everything else that we talk about in economics, we talk about profit maximization. The question becomes one of, what is the most profitable behavior to engage in? So each region had to go through that period of deciding on what was appropriate to grow, what was not appropriate to grow, what is it that they could actually grow, and then on top of that, would they be profitable in doing that? So it doesn't mean that you can decide, oh, we can grow tomatoes, great tomatoes in New Jersey, let's say. If you can't sell them profitably, it really doesn't make that much of a difference that you have the comparative advantage in growing tomatoes if you can't sell them in a marketplace and actually make a profit in doing so. So for example, in the Virginia and Maryland regions, tobacco and wheat could be profitably grown. All right, so that region, they had the comparative advantage in both tobacco and wheat production. The thing is, most farmers during this time period did not grow wheat because it was more profitable to grow tobacco. So a lot of farmers actually took upon themselves the risk of exclusively growing tobacco with the hope of selling it at a profit and using those profits and able to buy foodstuffs. All right, so realize that farmers during this time period had some type of trade-off, and it's something that we talk about in economics all the time, is the trade-offs that individuals have to engage in. These individuals could have grown either tobacco or wheat profitably, but they decided that the highest profit margin that they could get was in the production of tobacco. So they would actually risk starvation, the fact that they would not produce enough foodstuffs. They used those lands that they could have produced wheat to grow tobacco. So realize that these individual regions had to make these different types of trade-offs, that if they saw a staple product that could be grown profitably, they had to decide how much they were going to grow. And when they decided how much they were going to grow, for example, tobacco, the trade-off was that was less wheat that they could produce on their own to feed themselves. This got to be such an issue in Virginia that the governors of Virginia actually stated that farmers had to grow a minimum amount of wheat. Some instances that farms had to allocate a minimum of 2 acres to grow wheat. All right, so this is an early colonial example of government intervention in markets, that the profit maximizing farmers of that era decided that they were going to exclusively grow tobacco, and then there were governmental regulations put in place that mandated a minimum amount of acres had to be set aside for the production of wheat. So I just want you to be aware of that the intervention of government in economic affairs goes all the way back into colonial times when we talk about the history of the United States. That this was not a laissez-faire economy. The farmers did not get to decide on their own what they were going to produce and how they were going to produce it. There was some level of intervention in the markets, that the governors of Virginia were mandating a certain amount of acreage be set aside for the production of wheat. But it's also interesting to take a look at the fact that when tobacco prices changed relative to wheat prices, the Virginia farmers adjusted to that. So the farmers realized that as tobacco prices started to fall, it was less of their benefit to grow tobacco, and they switched over from tobacco production to wheat production. So you can see that their advantage to them changed over time. As the price of tobacco fell, they realized that they had a greater revenue source was available, and that the opportunity cost of producing tobacco, as the price was falling, there was even less and less value in wheat that they were producing. So let's take a look at some of the other regions. In New England, the thing I want you to realize about the New England colonies is the fact that New England had a lack of land that was available for agricultural use. The land quality was not very good. It was very rocky soil. You could not grow a number of staple products there, and also the fact of the weather. The growing season is much shorter in New England because it's the northern part of the colonies. So because of that shortage of arable land, of land that you could grow foodstuffs on, and the fact that the climate was not conducive to a long growing season, the individuals in New England shifted away from agricultural production to the exploitation of other natural resources. So what I want you to realize about the farming, I want you to realize that farming did not exist on the scale it did in other colonies. I also want you to realize that in New England, farming did exist. I don't want you to think that nobody was a farmer in New England. Farming did exist, but it was not as an important component of the economy compared to the middle states and the middle colonies, the northern the upper southern colonies, and the southern colonies. So New England, agriculture did exist, but it was not as important as the other areas of the colonies. The farming that did exist was subsistence farming, meaning that individuals who were farming to grow enough food to feed themselves. So it was not a commercial venture in New England. It was a subsistence venture. So a farmer was growing food to feed himself and his family. He was not growing food in order to sell to other regions. So there was no export of food occurring in New England. The food that was being grown in New England was to feed people in New England, and in the highest likelihood, just to feed the farmer who was actually growing that product. So I want you to realize that farming existed in New England, but it was subsistence farming. Farmers growing just enough food to feed themselves and their families. Well, so what did the New Englanders do other than farming? Well, what did they have the comparative advantage in? New England, number one, has a great supply of lumber, but also the wood that grows there is very strong wood. So instead of farming, for example, in the winter, you could lumber, you could cut down trees. Maple syrup in the spring. Running a forge, for example, to smelt iron or make other types of ore products was also available. Also, something that was very prevalent in New England, and we'll go on this later when we talk about some labor issues, is something called the putting out system. This is an early manufacturing method where entrepreneurs would provide the raw materials for finished products, and then they would put them out to local farmers for them to do some type of a production process on. So for example, an entrepreneur might get large amounts of wool and send that wool out to local farmers, or linens to local farmers, and they would spin it into fabric. So realize that this was a labor system, or let's say labor system, well, it is a labor system, but a system whereby entrepreneurs could take raw materials, send them out to individuals in their homes, and the individuals in the homes would do piecemeal work. Very prevalent in New England because of the fact that there's quite a bit of downtime on a farm, particularly the more north that you go. So those individuals have quite a bit of free time, and the entrepreneurs in New England realized this, that they had a ready pool of workers who could do piecemeal work in their homes. So realize that in New England, because of the fact that there was not enough arable land and the climate was not amenable to a long growing season, other types of industry started to develop, particularly lumber. And this is going to be important, lumber, because you needed wood to build ships. And shipping and having a large naval fleet was very important during this time period. So this is going to be a very important resource for the colonies. All right. Also realize that fishing is important. Sorry about that little delay there. Obviously, if fishing requires you to have ships, and if you have the natural resources of lumber that is useful in the building of ships, you're going to end up seeing a naval industry develop. And if you have a naval industry, it's a lot more likely that you're going to have a fishing industry. So also realize that, I want you to make sure you can tie that all together, is that because of the natural resource of the lumber that was available, this led to the production of sailing ships. And since they had the advantage in production of sailing ships, by default they would have the advantage in fishing. All right, and realize how important this was. I mean, you're producing about 10 million pounds of fish for export. So you realize that New England, number one, they have this large fishing fleet, but it's also a source of revenue for them because they are exporting that fish to New England. And this is going to tie into what when we talk later on about the balance of trade for the regions, that this was an important export source for New England, sending most of that to England itself. And it was a great employer. There were 665 vessels in the New England cod, just the cod fishing industry alone, that employed about 4,000 men. So I want you to realize, number one, it was how important the fishing industry was for employment in the region, also in the production of vessels, but also the fact that it was an important source of exports for New England. All right. Also, we've talked about if you catch fish, you got to process them. You've got to be able to store them and make sure that they don't go bad. The salting of fish was an important industry. So I want you to make sure you understand that all of this ties together from that comparative advantage I talked about. The fact that New England had the comparative advantage of the natural resources of the timber and the lumber that was in the area, it was natural that they would have some type of industry in building ships. Since they had the advantage in building ships, individuals actually moved from England to New England in order to build ships, that those ships were available for fishing. So you have the development of that industry along the way. And if you're going to ship fish, you're going to have to process fish. Remember, this was a time when, well before refrigeration, so fish had to be salted in order to be preserved, and that was a separate industry that developed out of this. Also, whaling was an important industry. All right, close to 400 whaling ships in the New England region. Whaling was important because the fact that that whale oil was used for lighting. All right, remember this is a time before electricity, and whale oil was a very important source of lighting during the time period. All right, so realize that tie-in, the fact that the natural resource of lumber that was available in New England led to the building of sea vessels, which allowed them to develop a fishing fleet, and that fishing fleet and whaling fleet was very, very important to the economy. Also, barrel production. Realize that if you have to ship things in this time period, barrels were the most predominant form of shipping container during this time period. So an individual who made barrels was somebody who was called a cooper, and actually that was somebody with a very high skill level. If you were a cooper during this time period, your wages were relatively higher than most other individuals. It was a skill set that was highly desired, and individual wages were quite high compared to the norm during that time period. All right, realize that there were other products available, particularly tar and pine. These were used as sealants. So again, materials from trees, etc., were used as sealants in the shipbuilding industry. So once again, they had the advantage of the fact that not only did they have the trees, but they had materials that could be used as sealants in the shipbuilding industry. Also realize that there were some minimal amounts of bog iron and wood, so that there was a ore industry, iron industry, very small iron industry compared to other regions, but there was other types of industry occurring, particularly in the production of iron. Now the middle colonies were the much more agricultural than New England. Number one, the soil was a much better state, and also the climate was much more amenable to growing foodstuffs. So when you think of the middle colonies, particularly New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, think of this as an agricultural region. This was at the agricultural base. Also realize that the middle colonies also had a shipping industry. All right, to have shipping, you have to have ports. So you have New York, you have Philadelphia, etc. You have access to the Delaware River. So because of that access to the ocean, that you're going to see a shipbuilding trade and also the shipping services trade. New York and Philadelphia, again, very large seaports, and they were very important commercial centers during that time period. So also when you think of natural advantage, having access to the sea and to have port systems or areas that could be readily converted into port facilities. Also, grain production was very, very important. If we think about this region along the Schuylkill River and the Brandywine rivers, there was a flourishing mill industry that would take wheat and grind it into flour so individuals could make bread with that. So realize that there was the industrialization that occurred in the middle colonies had to deal with the milling industry, the processing of wheat, etc., into flour, but also realize that we see New York and Philadelphia as thriving commercial ports. Now, if we take a look at the South was much more, was also agricultural, had a great deal of land for agriculture, also had raw materials and timber. But the thing I want to point out to you that the timbers that were available in the South, the trees that grow in the South, are not as transferable into the production of ships. So even though you do have a timber industry and you can make ships out of the timber that is there, the wood and timber that grows in New England is much more amenable to the production of large seafaring vessels. So that's why you end up seeing, you still see some ships being built in the South, but the vast majority of colonial shipping that's built during the time period occurs in New England because of the fact that they had the advantage of those natural resources. When you think of the agriculture, it tended to be self-sufficient. So the South was much more in self-sufficiency of foodstuffs, but they also produced export products. Remember that rice and indigo, these were items that were export items for the South. These are things, just like for the cod that was being caught and processed in New England that was being shipped to England. Rice and indigo were products in the South before cotton that were major export products. All right, so there was pitch, turpentine, and other resins that could be used as sealants in the South. So we do see the development of a small industry in the construction of vessels. The thing I want you to realize about Southern agriculture is the fact that the types of products that were grown there required a great deal of workers, particularly unskilled workers. All right, if you're growing wheat, you don't have to work those fields all year long. But if you're for example, the process of growing indigo, of growing rice, and finally when you move into cotton production, it's a very labor-intensive, pretty much all year round endeavor. So you need a very large workforce in order to grow those products. And what is often talked about with the South is that Southern agriculture during this time period, when it comes to rice, indigo, and especially when we start talking about cotton, is the presence of economies of scale when it comes to labor. That the larger your labor force, the more productive per unit your labor force is. This is a very important concept to talk about because when we talk about the economics of slavery, all right, we will the economics of slavery, this is something that's going to be very important, whether or not slave agriculture in the South exhibited economies of scale. All right, just as an example from your textbook, we see a few things where Georgia is a very good example of economies of scale when it comes to slave labor. Originally, planters in Georgia did not want to use slaves, that they actually were precluded from using slaves. After some very catastrophic crop failures, the locals in Georgia agitated for the legalization of slavery in 1749, and you can see how quickly the prevalence of slavery in Georgia expanded. In 1753, there were approximately 1,000 slaves in Georgia, and less than 17 years later, there were 10,000 slaves in Georgia. And as you can see right here, that 10,000 slaves represented 45% of the total population. So approximately for every slave there was a free person out there. So this just shows you the expansion of slavery in Georgia and how important it was to the local economy as it deals with of the forced labor force. If you assume that that every that he, you know, that all 10,000 of these slaves are in the labor force, and the free individuals in the labor force, roughly 50% of the labor force was a free labor force. It's one way to look at it. Now that's not an exact analysis. It's just a very rough example of it. But just realize that this is how important slave labor was to the economy of Georgia. And what we'll end up seeing is that it ends up being a very important component of the economy throughout the Lower South. Next, we're going to take a look at the percentages of slaves as a part of the total population. And this is an illustration as to how important slavery was to the different colonies. In particular, what I want you to understand from this is relatively where was slavery more important. If we take a look at New England, for example, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, we can see that it's not as important as in other regions, particularly if we take a look at the South. Look at South Carolina. 60% of the total population were slaves in South Carolina in 1770. When we take a look at New Hampshire, it's only 1%. In Massachusetts, 2%, Connecticut, 3%, and Rhode Island, 6.5%. So what's the economic explanation for this difference? Is that it was the slave agriculture and the slave system was much more efficient in the South. And we know this, number one, because in the North, in New England, what was happening? Small-scale agriculture was occurring in New England. Remember, the most prevalent form of agriculture was subsistence agriculture. Small farms producing just enough food to feed the families on those particular farms. So we have small-scale farms here. And when we start taking a look at the data, particularly when we go into detail about slavery later on, is that we see large plantations developing in the South. So we see large farm holdings in the South where we're seeing small farms in New England. So the size of the farm seems to have some relationship to the importance of slavery. And as you can see, if we go into the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, we see that relatively it's more important in the middle colonies than in New England, but it still does not match the importance of the South. And what's the difference here? That even though we had large-scale agriculture going on here, so we have subsistence agriculture in New England, we have large-scale agriculture in the middle colonies, the types of crops that were being grown in the middle colonies were not labor-intensive crops. They were crops that were labor-intensive at planting and at reaping, and at the other time you could pretty much leave them alone. So it wasn't an intensive a demand for labor throughout the year. So it was not amenable to a large slave labor force. So I want you to realize that the economic explanation for the differences in the distribution of slave utilization between New England, the middle colonies, and the South has to do with the type of agriculture that was being practiced. In New England, it was subsistence agriculture, which means small farm units that would not have a demand for a large labor force, free or unfree or slave. It gets more and more important in the middle colonies because we start seeing large-scale agriculture, but the types of products that were being grown, wheat, etc., the demand for a large labor force was not year-round. It was only a high demand for labor when you were planting the crop and then when you were reaping the crop, when you were collecting the crop. It's much more important in the South because the type of agriculture that was being practiced in the South was very labor-intensive. And one of the things that we'll talk about later on is that the slave labor system exhibited economies of scale. The larger the scale of operation, the more slaves you had on a plantation, the more efficient the individual slaves were. So I want you to realize that what is the explanation for the difference in the importance of slave agriculture in New England versus the middle colonies versus the South. All right. Also realize that the South was more rural, so there was a greater demand for skilled labor because of the type of agriculture that was going on. I already went over that. The other thing I want you to realize is why the dependence on slave labor. Why not just hire people to do it? The type of work that was going on, particularly in the rice and the indigo fields, and then when we switch over to cotton production, it's very strenuous work. It's not the type of work that people freely want to engage in. And if they do engage in it, they want a premium above the prevailing wage rate. You know, for example, if you have to do work that's difficult or risky or particularly unpleasant, people generally have to be paid more in order to engage in that type of work. Well, how do you avoid paying wage premiums to individuals to get them to do unpleasant work? You force them to do it. You buy individuals and force them into slavery and force them to do the work. All right? So realize that another component of, when we talk about the need for the labor force, the next question that comes in is why was the slave labor force the one that was used versus a free labor force? Realize that the type of work that was being done on these southern plantations was very strenuous work. It was difficult work under very difficult conditions, high heat, high humidity. And individuals who are free workers can say, I don't want to do this, or you know what, you're not paying me enough. Slave labor can't do that. Slave labor is stuck doing that type of work. All right, I talked about this previously. We also end up seeing large-scale holdings, the prevalence of large-scale land holdings at a much higher level than we do in the North and the Middle colonies. Particularly, I want you to be aware of this notion of primogeniture, meaning that your estates were not automatically broken up. Primogeniture means that your oldest son inherits the entire estate. So if you're the oldest son, you get the entire estate. If the primogeniture is not the law of inheritance of a particular region, it means that your estate is divided up amongst your sons. So for example, if you have 4 sons, your estate gets split up between 4 individuals. So because of this law of primogeniture, the fact that the oldest son inherited the entire estate, you ended up seeing large land holdings in the South, but these large land holdings had a tendency to stay as large land holdings. They did not get split up into smaller estates when the father passed away. So realize that is a key component as to why we end up seeing slavery in the South, is the fact that this notion of primogeniture, that the eldest son inherits the entire estate, means that you have larger land holdings in the South than you do in regions that do not have the primogeniture law, that inheritance law. Well, how does this impact wealth? Let's take a look at the wealth that we end up seeing for the entire colonies, New England and middle colonies, upper and lower South. So the American colonies, the net worth per free person in the American colonies was about 74 pounds. So this is the average for all the colonies from 1770 to 1775. So these are estimates. Well, let's take a look at how that gets distributed. Let's take a look at the upper and lower South. Almost twice the net worth per free person in the South than overall. And when we compare the South to New England, it's almost 4 times. So you can see a great concentration of wealth in the upper and lower South. All right, many people would argue that this is because of the slave labor system, that the presence of the slave labor system allowed there to be a concentration of wealth in the upper and lower South. I mean, if we look at this, if we look at the distribution of how important slavery was, it was least important in New England, slightly more important in the middle colonies, and the most important in New England. And if you follow that, you can see that the least wealthiest is New England, and then we see an increase in wealth when we go to the middle colonies, and then we see the wealthiest part of the colonies being the upper and the lower South. So it's easy to see that this relationship, that the prevalence of slavery is also associated with higher levels of wealth. The South and upper and lower South is where slavery was the most important. That was the wealthiest portion of the colonies during the time period. And the section of the colonies, New England, that had the lowest dependence upon slavery also had the lower level of income. That's the end of part one for this section. I'm splitting this up into two because I have a couple of diagrams that I want to go over, and I want to have a different view of these. So this is the end of part one.